Hello, dear history travelers. Welcome back to our journey through the shadows of the past, where we uncover the stories that textbooks forgot and history tried to bury. I'm so glad you're here with me today. Before we begin this tale of ambition, tragedy, and the cruel ironies of royal blood, I want to ask you for a small favor. If you enjoy these deep dives into history's most compelling stories, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and ring that notification bell. Your support allows us to continue bringing these forgotten voices back to life, and it means the world to me. Also, if you find yourself captivated by today's story, drop a comment below sharing which historical figure you'd like to hear about next. I read every single one, and your suggestions shape our content. Now let's turn down the lights, get comfortable, and travel together back to an age of stone castles, disputed crowns, and the men who called themselves kings, even as their kingdoms slipped through their fingers like sand. Imagine for a moment that you are born into ultimate privilege. Your blood is the purest royal blue. Your name carries the weight of centuries. From your first breath, servants bow, nobles defer, and every comfort the medieval world can offer is yours. You are taught that you are chosen by God Himself to rule, that a crown is not just your right, but your divine destiny. Now imagine that destiny crumbling. Imagine watching from the shadows as someone else sits on your throne. Imagine signing documents as king while hiding in foreign courts, hunted, impoverished, mocked. Imagine your own people forgetting your name, or worse, remembering it only as a cautionary tale. This is not fantasy. This is not fiction. This is the true story of medieval Europe's ghost kings, the claimants without kingdoms, the monarchs without realms, the sovereigns of nothing but their own shattered dreams. Today, we will walk with these tragic figures through their rise to promise and their fall into obscurity. We'll explore how a single battle, a political marriage, or a moment of betrayal could transform a king into a beggar, a prince into a pretender. These are stories of human ambition at its most naked, of pride that refused to bend even as reality shattered it, and of the terrible price paid by those who dared to reach for crowns that would never touch their heads. Their names echo through history: Henry VI, who reigned as a shadow while his mind fractured; Perkin Warbeck, who may or may not have been a prince; Lambert Simnel, the boy king who ended his days serving beer; and many others whose stories will break your heart and make you question everything you thought you knew about power, legitimacy, and the true meaning of kingship. So settle in. This is going to be a long journey through some of history's darkest corridors, but I promise you, it will be worth every moment. To understand how one becomes a king without a kingdom, we must first understand what kingship meant in the medieval mind. In our modern world, we think of leadership as something earned, or at least validated by democratic process. But in medieval Europe, kingship was considered something fundamentally different. It was a sacred bond between man, God, and the land itself. Kings weren't merely political leaders. They were anointed vessels of divine will, their authority flowing directly from heaven to earth through the ritual of coronation. This belief created a peculiar paradox. On one hand, the king's legitimacy was theoretically absolute and unquestionable. He ruled by God's grace, not by the consent of the governed. On the other hand, this divine mandate was constantly being tested, challenged, and redefined by the harsh realities of medieval politics. Military strength, noble alliances, and the ever-present threat of usurpation. The medieval world operated on a principle we might call sacred pragmatism. Yes, kings ruled by divine right, but God, it seemed, favored those with the largest armies. Yes, bloodline mattered enormously, but only if you could defend it with steel and gold. Yes, the crown was sacred, but it could be taken, hidden, melted down, or placed on another head if circumstances demanded it. This tension created the perfect conditions for our ghost kings to emerge. When two people could claim equally legitimate blood rights to a throne, when succession laws were vague or contradictory, when military might trump legal right, you could end up with multiple kings of the same kingdom. Some ruling in fact, others ruling only in name and their own desperate imagination. The concept of legitimacy itself was fascinatingly fluid. A usurper who successfully held a throne for long enough could become legitimate simply through the passage of time and the acquiescence of the nobility. Meanwhile, a rightful heir who failed to press his claim effectively might find his legitimacy evaporating like morning mist, remembered only in dusty documents and bitter complaints penned in exile. Consider the coronation ceremony itself, that elaborate ritual in which a man became more than a man, the anointing with holy oil, the placing of the crown, the presentation of the regalia. These weren't mere pageantry. They were the visible signs of an invisible transformation. A coronation made kingship real in a way that mere bloodline could not. This is why so many of our claimants desperately sought coronation ceremonies, even pathetic shadow versions in foreign lands, even when they controlled no territory and commanded no armies. The ritual itself held power. But what happened when that ritual was denied? What happened when your blood said you were king, but no bishop would anoint you, no crown would touch your head, no people would cheer your name? You became something unprecedented and tragic, a king in theory but a ghost in practice, haunting the courts of Europe, demanding recognition that would never come, fighting wars you could never win, for a birthright that had become more curse than blessing. The medieval world was not kind to these men. It had no category for them, no honored place. You were either king or you were not. To claim kingship without power was to invite mockery. To press your claim without success was to prove that God himself had withdrawn his favor. And yet they could not stop. Their blood would not let them. Their pride would not permit it. And so they fought on, these sad shadows of sovereignty, becoming increasingly desperate, increasingly irrelevant, and increasingly tragic. Our first story begins with perhaps the most heartbreaking king without a kingdom in English history. Henry VI, a man who was crowned king of two nations as an infant and ended his life a prisoner in the Tower of London. His mind shattered, his kingdoms lost, remembered more for his piety and madness than for any royal achievement. Henry was born in 1421 at Windsor Castle, the only child of the magnificent Henry V, the warrior king who had conquered France and stood on the verge of uniting two great kingdoms under one crown. Baby Henry's future seemed impossibly bright, but fate is cruel to those born with too much promise. Henry V died suddenly in 1422, leaving his 9-month-old son as King of England. Weeks later, the French king, Charles VI, also died, and by the terms of the Treaty of Troyes, little Henry became King of France as well. Here was an infant who ruled more of Europe than any English king before or since. It should have been the beginning of an era of unprecedented power. Instead, it was the beginning of a long, slow tragedy. The boy who grew from that infant was nothing like his warrior father. Henry VI was gentle, pious, more interested in education and religious devotion than in the arts of war and statecraft. He was kind to a fault, generous beyond wisdom, and utterly unprepared for the cutthroat world of medieval politics. Some historians suggest he may have had learning difficulties, or what we might now recognize as a mild developmental disorder. Others paint him as a saint born into the wrong role. Whatever the truth, he was catastrophically unsuited to be king. As Henry grew to adulthood, the dual monarchy his father had fought to create began to crumble. In France, a new figure had emerged, Charles VII, the Dauphin whom the Treaty of Troyes had disinherited. Inspired by Joan of Arc and supported by a resurgent French nationalism, Charles VII systematically reconquered the territories Henry V had won. City by city, province by province, the French kingdom that baby Henry had inherited slipped away. By 1453, England had lost everything in France except Calais. The great dream of a united Anglo-French kingdom was dead, and Henry VI, who still styled himself King of France, had become exactly what we're discussing today. A king without a kingdom, maintaining a claim to a crown that sat firmly on someone else's head. But the tragedy was only beginning. That same year, 1453, Henry suffered the first of what would be several catastrophic mental breakdowns. The exact nature of his illness remains debated. Some historians suggest catatonic schizophrenia, others a severe depressive disorder. Still others point to a possible inherited condition from his French grandfather, Charles VI, who had famously believed he was made of glass and could shatter at any moment. Whatever the medical truth, the political reality was devastating. For over a year, Henry was completely unresponsive, unable to speak, unable to recognize even his own wife and newborn son. He was king in name only, a breathing corpse on a throne that others would now fight to control. When Henry eventually recovered his senses, England had changed. The Duke of York had tasted power as protector of the realm and was unwilling to give it up. The great noble houses had chosen sides. The Wars of the Roses, that 30-year bloodbath that would consume English political life, had begun. Henry would be king again, then deposed, then briefly restored, then imprisoned. For the last years of his life, this man who had been crowned king of two nations lived in the Tower of London, a prisoner in his own realm, forgotten by most, pitied by some, relevant to none. He would be murdered there in 1471, probably on the orders of the man who had taken his throne, Edward IV. But here's what makes Henry VI's story particularly poignant for our purposes. Even in prison, even with his mind broken and his throne occupied by another, Henry was still technically king. He had been properly crowned, properly anointed. The legitimacy of his blood was unquestionable. He was the direct male heir of the Plantagenet line, and yet he had no kingdom, no power, no freedom. He was the purest expression of our theme, a sacred king rendered profane by his own weakness, a divinely appointed monarch whom God seemed to have abandoned. Documents from this period show something both fascinating and heartbreaking. Letters and proclamations issued by the Lancastrian faction still dated themselves according to Henry's regnal years, still referred to him as the rightful king of England and France, even as Edward IV ruled in London and crowned himself in Westminster Abbey. Two kings, two claims, two incompatible realities existing simultaneously. For the supporters who clung to Henry's cause, even after his restoration failed, even after his death, Henry VI remained the true king. They were loyal not to the man, this shattered, ineffectual prisoner, but to the principle he represented: legitimacy, sacred bloodline, the unbreakable chain of royal succession. These abstractions meant more to them than the concrete reality of who actually held power. And so Henry VI spent his last days as a living contradiction, the most legitimate king England had and the most powerless, a king without a kingdom, a symbol of divine right without any divine favor. A warning to all who would come after about the terrible gap that can open between rightful authority and actual power. His story teaches us something profound about the nature of kingship in the medieval world. The crown was both everything and nothing. It could elevate a baby to rule millions, and it could mean absolutely nothing when stripped of the power to enforce its will. Henry VI proved that you could be the most legitimate king imaginable and still die forgotten in a prison cell. Your kingdoms ruled by others, your name invoked only by those who had lost as badly as you had. No discussion of kings without kingdoms would be complete without addressing one of history's most enduring mysteries and the cascade of pretenders it spawned: the disappearance of the princes in the tower and the young men who claimed to be them. The year is 1483. King Edward IV has just died unexpectedly, leaving behind two young sons: Edward, Prince of Wales, age 12, and Richard, Duke of York, age 9. These boys are the rightful heirs to the English throne, the continuation of the Yorkist line that had fought so hard to take the crown from Henry VI. What happens next has been debated for over 500 years, inspiring countless books, plays, theories, and investigations. The boy's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was appointed protector of the realm with the duty to safeguard his nephews and ensure the smooth succession of young Edward V. Instead, Richard declared both boys illegitimate, claiming their father's marriage was invalid due to a prior betrothal. Parliament accepted this claim. Richard took the throne as Richard III, and the two princes disappeared. They were seen for a time in the Tower of London, playing in the gardens, visible from outside. Then they were moved to inner chambers. Then they were seen less frequently. Then not at all. By the summer of 1483, no one saw them anymore. No announcement was made, no bodies were produced. They simply ceased to exist in the public record, as if they had been erased from the world. This disappearance created something unprecedented, a vacuum of legitimate succession so profound that it would generate pretenders for generations. If the princes were dead, who killed them? If they lived, where were they? And most importantly, could they be used to challenge the Tudor dynasty that would eventually take the throne? Enter Lambert Simnel, our first ghost king of this tale. In 1487, a boy of about 10 years old appeared in Ireland, presented by Yorkist conspirators as Edward, Earl of Warwick, the son of Edward IV's brother George, Duke of Clarence, and therefore a legitimate Yorkist heir. The boy was crowned Edward VI in a ceremony at Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin. Here we see that desperate reaching for legitimacy through ritual that we discussed earlier. The conspirators knew that a coronation, any coronation, would give their pretender a patina of rightful kingship. Lambert, for that was apparently his real name, Lambert Simnel, son of an Oxford joiner, was then brought to England at the head of an army of Irish and Flemish mercenaries. These men were fighting to restore a boy they believed was the rightful king, to overthrow Henry VII, the Tudor who had won the throne at Bosworth Field in 1485. The young king and his army met Henry VII's forces at the Battle of Stokefield in 1487. It was a vicious fight, lasting for 3 hours, with thousands dead on both sides. But in the end, the royal army prevailed. The rebellion was crushed. Many of the leaders were executed. And Lambert, here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Henry VII, in a remarkable show of both mercy and contempt, spared the boy's life. He reasoned that Lambert was merely a pawn, a child manipulated by ambitious men who knew exactly what they were doing. As a demonstration of just how little threat this king posed, Henry gave Lambert a job in the royal kitchens, first as a spit turner, later as a falconer. Imagine that trajectory: crowned king in a cathedral, leading an army into battle, ending your days serving food in the household of the man whose throne you tried to take. Lambert Simnel lived for decades after his failed bid for kingship, a living reminder that some pretenders are too pathetic even to kill, that some claims to kingship are so transparently false that they merit only mockery. But Lambert was just the beginning. The real test of Henry VII's reign would come in the form of a much more sophisticated pretender, Perkin Warbeck. In 1490, a handsome young man in his late teens appeared at the court of Burgundy, claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the two princes supposedly murdered in the Tower. This young man spoke English with an aristocratic accent, had courtly manners, knew details about the English royal family, and was recognized as genuine by Edward IV's own sister, Margaret of Burgundy, who became his most powerful supporter. Perkin Warbeck's story was compelling. He claimed that he and his brother had indeed been taken to the Tower to be murdered, but that the assassins had pitied him and killed another boy in his place, spiriting him away to the continent where he'd been raised in hiding until it was safe to reveal himself. Was it true? We'll never know with certainty, but it was believable enough that several European monarchs accepted him as genuine, that the King of Scotland treated him as a fellow sovereign, and that thousands of Englishmen were willing to risk their lives for his cause. For nearly a decade, Perkin Warbeck was a king without a kingdom. He was styled as Richard IV by his supporters. He issued proclamations in the name of the rightful King of England. He was married to a Scottish noblewoman in a ceremony befitting royalty. He invaded England twice, attempting to claim his supposed birthright by force. But he never succeeded. His invasions failed. His support dwindled. Eventually captured and imprisoned by Henry VII, Perkin confessed that he was actually the son of a Flemish boatman, that his entire identity as a prince had been fabricated. Whether this confession was true or extracted under duress, we cannot know. What we do know is that after attempting to escape from the Tower of London, Perkin Warbeck was hanged at Tyburn in 1499. The tragic irony? He was executed alongside the real Edward, Earl of Warwick, the person Lambert Simnel had pretended to be. This genuinely legitimate Yorkist heir had been imprisoned since childhood, guilty of nothing except having royal blood. Henry VII could tolerate a fake pretender turned servant, but he could not allow a real claimant and a convincing impostor to exist simultaneously. Both were executed, ending the male Plantagenet line that had ruled England for over 300 years. What makes these stories particularly haunting is the uncertainty that still surrounds them. Were Lambert and Perkins cynical frauds who knew exactly what they were doing? Were they deluded young men who came to believe their own stories? Were they pawns manipulated by others? Or, in Perkins' case at least, was there a chance, however slim, that his story was true? We'll never know. But what we do know is that they represent something psychologically fascinating: the power of royal identity as pure performance. Lambert and Perkin proved that with the right coaching, the right supporters, and the right circumstances, anyone could play king. They showed that medieval kingship, for all its sacred mystery, was also a role that could be performed, a script that could be learned, a costume that could be worn by any player bold enough to try, and they paid the ultimate price for that performance. One ended his days as a servant, stripped of dignity but allowed to live, a walking joke. The other ended his days swinging from a rope, his true identity unknown even to himself by the end. Both were kings without kingdoms. Both achieved coronations of a sort, commanded armies, issued royal proclamations, and inspired loyalty. And both discovered that being king requires more than claiming to be one. It requires the power to make that claim stick, the army to defend it, the legitimacy to sustain it. Without those things, you're not a king. You're just a pretender. And history remembers pretenders only as cautionary tales. Let us move forward in time now to a later era, but a remarkably similar story, one that would span generations and reshape British politics for over a century. This is the tale of the Jacobite claimants, the Stuart kings who ruled in name only, maintaining shadow courts in exile while other monarchs occupied their throne. The story begins with a religious revolution. In 1688, the Catholic king James II of England, James VII of Scotland, was overthrown in what English historians cheerfully call the Glorious Revolution. His crime? Being Catholic in a Protestant nation and producing a Catholic heir. His Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband William of Orange were invited by Parliament to take the throne, which they did, landing with an army and forcing James into exile. James II fled to France, where King Louis XIV, his fellow Catholic monarch, received him with honor and provided him with a palace at Saint-Germain-en-Laye. And there, in this beautiful chateau overlooking the Seine, James II maintained a full royal court in exile. He had courtiers, ministers, a Lord Chancellor, a Secretary of State. He issued proclamations, granted titles, conducted diplomacy. He was, in every ceremonial sense, still King of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Except, of course, he wasn't. The real power lay with William and Mary in London. The real armies answered to them. The real taxes flowed into their treasury. James II was a king without a kingdom, maintaining the elaborate fiction of continued sovereignty while the world moved on without him. What makes the Jacobite story different from our earlier examples is its longevity and the genuine popular support it commanded, especially in Scotland and Ireland. James II was not a pathetic pretender or an obvious fraud. He was an anointed king who had been overthrown for political and religious reasons, and many people, perhaps even a majority in Scotland, considered his removal illegitimate. The Jacobites were kings without kingdoms on an unprecedented scale. They maintained the full apparatus of monarchy: courts, ministers, titles, honors, diplomatic relations, without any of the substance. They were shadows of sovereignty, echoes of authority, living proof that you can have every legal right to be king and still be utterly, completely powerless. Their story asks us to consider, what makes a king? Is it the sacred bloodline, the rightful succession, the anointing with holy oil? Or is it simply the ability to command armies, collect taxes, and make your will into law? The Jacobites had the former. The Hanoverians who replaced them had the latter. History remembers the Hanoverians as the real kings and the Jacobites as romantic failures. But to the Jacobites themselves, to the Highlanders who died for them at Culloden, to the Irish who fought for them at the Boyne, they were the true kings. And perhaps that's the saddest part of all, that you can be absolutely certain of your rightful sovereignty, willing to die for it, willing to devote your entire life to it, and still be completely, utterly wrong in every way that matters. Now let us turn to one of history's most poignant examples of kings without kingdoms, the succession of Byzantine emperors in exile after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. This is a story that combines religious conviction, imperial dignity, and heartbreaking futility in equal measure. For over 1,000 years, the Byzantine Empire stood as the continuation of Rome itself. Constantinople, built on the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, was the new Rome, the greatest city in Christendom, the bridge between East and West. Its emperors traced their authority in an unbroken line back to Augustus Caesar and Constantine the Great. They ruled not just as political leaders, but as God's chosen representatives on earth, defenders of Orthodox Christianity, bearers of a sacred trust that stretched back to antiquity. Then in May 1453, everything ended. After a siege of 53 days, Ottoman forces under Sultan Mehmed II breached the walls of Constantinople. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, died fighting in the streets, sword in hand, choosing to fall with his city rather than flee. His body was never found. The Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of Rome, ceased to exist. Or did it? Constantine XI had brothers. He had relatives. He had a dynasty behind him. And in the minds of many Byzantine refugees, the empire had not truly fallen. It had merely been displaced. Somewhere in exile, the true emperor still lived, maintaining the dignity and authority of Rome, even without Rome itself. Thomas Palaiologos, Constantine's brother, escaped the fall of Constantinople and fled to Italy with his children, including his sons Andreas and Manuel. The Pope received them with honor, granted them pensions, and Thomas proclaimed himself despot of the Morea, a title he had actually held before the fall. He spent his remaining years in Rome, maintaining a small court of Byzantine refugees, preserving Greek manuscripts, and petitioning Western monarchs to launch a crusade to recapture Constantinople. The crusade never came. Thomas died in 1465, but his claim to the Byzantine imperial throne passed to his sons. Andreas Palaiologos styled himself as the legitimate Byzantine emperor, though he ruled over nothing but memories and a handful of loyal refugees. He lived in poverty in Rome, sustained by papal charity and the occasional grant from Western monarchs who found it useful to recognize a Christian claimant to Constantinople. In 1494, in an act of breathtaking desperation, Andreas sold his rights to the Byzantine throne. And who did he sell them to? Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Yes, the same monarchs who sponsored Columbus also purchased, for a small sum, the claim to be the rightful heirs of Constantine the Great. Andreas died in poverty shortly thereafter, the last male-line descendant of the last Byzantine emperor. But the claim he sold lived on, passing through Spanish and eventually Austro-Hungarian royal houses. For centuries, the Habsburgs of Austria would include among their many titles the claim to be the rightful emperors of Byzantium, a claim utterly meaningless except as a curiosity for historians. But there's another branch of this story, even more fascinating. Some Byzantine nobles fled not west to Italy, but north to Russia. There they found willing listeners to their claims of legitimate succession. Grand Prince Ivan III of Moscow married Sophia Palaiologina, a niece of the last Byzantine emperor. Through this marriage, Ivan proclaimed Moscow to be the Third Rome, the true successor to Constantinople and the defender of Orthodox Christianity. Russian czars would, for centuries afterward, claim to be the legitimate heirs of Byzantium. They adopted the double-headed eagle of the Byzantine Empire as their symbol. They styled themselves as Tsar, Caesar, explicitly connecting themselves to the Roman imperial tradition. They saw themselves as the defenders of Orthodox Christianity, the role the Byzantine emperors had played. Were they kings without kingdoms? In a sense, yes. They claimed to be emperors of Byzantium while ruling from Moscow, thousands of miles from Constantinople. They maintained this claim even as Constantinople remained firmly in Ottoman hands, its population converted to Islam or scattered. The city they claimed to rule had become Istanbul, capital of an Islamic empire, more foreign to Orthodox Christianity than it had ever been. Yet the Russians made their claim real through power. They conquered vast territories. They built magnificent churches in the Byzantine style. They preserved Greek Orthodox traditions. They became, in fact, if not in law, the new Byzantium, not by reconquering the old empire, but by creating a new one that embodied its principles. This raises a profound question. If you have the power to make your claim meaningful, are you still a king without a kingdom? Or have you created a new kingdom to match your claim? The Russians succeeded where the Jacobites and the Stuart pretenders failed. They transformed a theoretical claim into actual power, ghost sovereignty into real empire. But back in Italy, the original Byzantine refugees had no such success. For them, the imperial claim remained purely theoretical, a badge of ancient dignity worn by men living in poverty and irrelevance. Imagine being Andreas Palaiologos, descendant of emperors, bearer of a name that had once commanded legions and governed millions, reduced to selling your birthright for a pittance because you literally had no other assets to trade. The Byzantine exiles maintained a shadow court of scholars, priests, and nobles who preserved Greek learning, translated ancient manuscripts, and taught Western Europeans about the classical heritage. In this way, they influenced the Renaissance, helping to birth the modern world even as their own world had died. They were kings of culture, if not of territory, emperors of scholarship, if not of state. And yet how many of them would have traded all of that for just one more glimpse of Constantinople in its glory? How many would have given every ancient manuscript just to walk once more through the Hagia Sophia when it was still a church, not a mosque? How many died in exile whispering prayers in Greek, dreaming of a city they would never see again? The Byzantine story is unique among our tales of kings without kingdoms because it involves the loss not just of a throne, but of an entire civilization. When the Stuarts lost Britain, Britain continued to exist. When Henry VI lost France, France flourished under other kings. But when Constantinople fell, Byzantine civilization itself was extinguished. The exiled emperors weren't just claiming a throne, they were keeping alive the memory of an entire lost world. Their claim was hopeless from the start. Constantinople would never be Christian again. The Byzantine Empire would never be restored. And yet they maintained their dignity, their titles, their identity as the true heirs of Rome for generations. Some claims are maintained not because there's any hope of success, but because abandoning them would mean admitting that everything you are, everything your ancestors built, everything you believe in has been erased from history. The Byzantine emperors in exile were custodians of a dead dream, but they kept that dream alive through sheer stubborn refusal to accept reality. And in doing so, they gave us one of the most moving examples of kings without kingdoms. Men who maintained imperial dignity while living in poverty, who claimed to rule an empire that existed only in memory, who were sovereigns of nothing but their own unshakable conviction that what they represented, the unbroken line of Rome, was too sacred to ever truly die. We've now met several of history's ghost kings, and a pattern emerges. Let's pause here to consider the psychological and human cost of being a king without a kingdom. What it does to a person to maintain a claim that everyone knows is futile, to insist on dignity that the world refuses to recognize. First, there is the fundamental dissonance between identity and reality. From birth, these men were taught that they were special, chosen, divinely ordained to rule. Their entire self-concept was built on this foundation. To admit that they would never rule, that their claim was meaningless, would require them to rebuild their entire identity from nothing. Most people cannot do this. It's psychologically easier to maintain a delusion than to face such a catastrophic loss of self. Consider Charles Edward Stuart in his later years. A once handsome, charismatic prince reduced to a bitter alcoholic wandering around Italy, insisting people address him as Your Majesty, while everyone around him knew he was nothing of the sort. His tragedy wasn't just that he lost his bid for the throne, it was that he couldn't accept the loss and move forward. He remained frozen in the moment of his greatest hope, unable to adapt to reality, unable to become anything other than a failed pretender. This psychological rigidity was common among our ghost kings. They couldn't pivot to other roles or identities. They couldn't say, well, I'm not going to be king, so let me find meaning in something else. Their entire purpose in life was bound up with a claim they could never successfully press. This created a kind of existential paralysis. They were alive, but they had no real life, only the endless performance of a role without a stage. Second, there's the matter of dignity and mockery. Medieval and early modern societies were ruthlessly hierarchical and acutely attuned to status. A man who claimed to be king, but was obviously powerless, invited scorn. He became a figure of fun, a living joke. Some pretenders, like Lambert Simnel, were deliberately preserved as objects of mockery, living proof that the king could afford to be merciful to threats so pathetic they weren't worth killing. Imagine the daily humiliation. You claim to be king, and people laugh. You issue proclamations, and they're ignored. You grant titles and honors, and they're worthless. Every interaction becomes a reminder of your powerlessness. Every day, a fresh wound to your pride. Some men broke under this pressure. They became increasingly erratic, desperately attempting to shore up their crumbling dignity through ever more elaborate claims and ceremonies. They surrounded themselves with sycophants who would play along with the fiction, creating echo chambers where their sovereignty seemed real. But they knew the truth. In quiet moments, they had to know. Third, there's the trap of hope. Perhaps the most psychologically cruel aspect of being a king without a kingdom is that it was never completely impossible to succeed. There were enough successful restorations, enough unexpected turns of fortune in medieval and early modern politics, that pretenders could always believe that their moment might come. This hope kept them going, but it also trapped them. They couldn't give up and build normal lives because what if their chance came? They had to remain ready, maintain their networks, preserve their claims. Hope became a kind of prison, forcing them to dedicate their entire lives to a goal that became less achievable with each passing year. James Francis Edward Stuart, the old pretender, spent literally his entire life waiting for his restoration. From infancy to old age, he was preparing to be king. He studied statecraft, learned languages, maintained diplomatic relations, plotted invasions, and he died in exile, having never ruled anything. Imagine the tragedy of a life so comprehensively wasted on a dream that never materialized. Fourth, there's the cost to those around them. These pretenders didn't suffer alone. They had supporters, followers, and families who paid horrific prices for their hopeless causes. Think of the Highland clans who followed Bonnie Prince Charlie to Culloden. After the battle, the British government systematically destroyed Highland culture, banning traditional dress, breaking up clan structures, forcibly relocating populations, all because they had supported a pretender's impossible dream or considered the Byzantine refugees who followed their exiled emperors to Italy. They left behind homes, property, entire lives to remain loyal to a dynasty that could offer them nothing but poverty and displacement. Loyalty to a king without a kingdom often meant choosing honor over practicality, principle over survival. The families of pretenders suffered especially acutely. The children of Jacobite claimants were raised in exile, educated to be princes and princesses of kingdoms they would never rule. They learned languages for courts they would never attend. They were prepared for roles that didn't exist. Some adapted and found other purposes. But many, like Charles Edward Stuart's brother Henry, ended up in strange half-lives. A cardinal who claimed to be a king, a priest who styled himself as royalty. Fifth, and perhaps most tragically, there's the loss of what might have been. Many of these men had genuine talents and abilities. Charles Edward Stuart was charismatic and brave, qualities that might have made him genuinely great in another role. Henry VI, despite his weakness as a king, was genuinely pious and founded both Eton and King's College, Cambridge. Andreas Palaiologos, for all his poverty, was a learned man who contributed to the Renaissance transmission of Greek knowledge. But their identities as pretenders consumed all other possibilities. They couldn't be scholars or soldiers or statesmen in their own right because they were too busy being failed kings. The role of pretender was all-consuming, leaving no room for other accomplishments or identities. Their lives became performances of thwarted sovereignty and nothing else. Finally, there's the question of truth and delusion. Did these men truly believe in their claims, or were they conscious frauds? The answer seems to vary by individual and probably changed over time. Some, like Perkin Warbeck, may have started as cynical impersonators and gradually come to believe their own stories. Others, like the Stuart claimants, never doubted their legitimacy for a moment. But even for the true believers, there must have been moments of doubt. Nights when pretense fell away and they faced the stark reality of their situation. Moments when they wondered if God had truly chosen them, or if their entire lives were built on a mistaken assumption. These moments of existential doubt might have been the hardest to bear, worse than any external mockery or failure. The psychological cost of being a king without a kingdom, then, was immense. It created men trapped between delusion and despair, unable to accept reality, but also unable to escape it. It destroyed families, wasted lives, and left a trail of tragedy across European history. And it raises profound questions about identity, purpose, and the terrible price of living for something that can never be achieved. One of the most fascinating aspects of kings without kingdoms is the elaborate legal and governmental structures they maintained, despite having no actual power. These weren't just men proclaiming themselves king in empty words. They created entire shadow governments, complete bureaucracies, formal courts, and legal systems governing populations that didn't exist or didn't acknowledge them. The Stuart court at Saint-Germain-en-Laye is perhaps the best documented example. James II didn't simply live in comfortable exile in France. He maintained a complete parallel government to the one functioning in London. He had a Lord Chancellor who kept the Great Seal of England, or at least a version of it. He had a Secretary of State who managed diplomatic correspondence. He had a keeper of the privy purse who managed finances, such as they were. He had courtiers with formal roles, ceremonies conducted according to proper protocol, and a rigid hierarchy of precedence. This shadow government issued real documents: royal warrants, commissions, patents of nobility, pardons for crimes committed in England, all signed and sealed as if the Stuart court was the legitimate government of Britain. Some of these documents still exist in archives, strange artifacts of a government that never was. What makes this even more interesting is that these documents sometimes had real legal consequences. In areas of Britain where Jacobite sympathies ran strong, particularly in Highland Scotland, Stuart commissions and patents were sometimes honored alongside or even instead of official government documents. A landowner might hold two titles, one from the Hanoverian government in London and one from the Stuart court in France, and which one he used would depend on his audience. The exiled Stuart court even maintained a spy network in Britain, collecting intelligence and sending back detailed reports on political developments, military movements, and potential supporters. These reports were filed, analyzed, and used to plan invasions that mostly never happened. It was governance as performance art, all the apparatus of power without the power itself. Perhaps even more elaborate were the Byzantine emperors in exile. The Byzantine Empire had the most complex administrative system in medieval Europe, and the emperors in exile attempted to maintain it despite having no empire to administer. They had palace officials with grandiose titles: Megas Du, Grand Duke; Sebastocrator, almost emperor; Despotes, Lord. These offices continued to be bestowed, their holders performing ceremonial duties for an empire that existed only in their imagination. There was even a great palace in exile, not a physical palace so much as a conceptual one. Wherever the emperor in exile held court became, by definition, the sacred palace, the center of the Byzantine world. The protocol, the ceremonies, the hierarchies were maintained with meticulous care because these rituals were what made the emperor an emperor. Without them, he was just another refugee. These shadow governments served several purposes. First, they maintained the pretender's own belief in their legitimacy. If you have a chancellor and a secretary of state and a whole court conducting business, then you're not just playing pretend, you're running a government. The elaborate apparatus of governance made the claim seem real, at least to those inside the bubble. Second, they kept alive hope for restoration. A shadow government could theoretically step in and take over if the ruling regime fell. The exiled Stuarts genuinely believed that when the Hanoverian line fell, as surely it must, being usurpers, there would need to be a legitimate government ready to restore order. Their shadow court existed partly as a government in waiting. Third, they provided structure and purpose for the exiled community. The followers of pretenders needed roles, status, something to do. The shadow government gave them these things. You might be a poor refugee in France, but if you were also the exiled King's Lord Chamberlain, you had dignity and purpose. The government existed partly to keep its own members psychologically functional. Fourth, they were tools of diplomacy. European monarchs who wanted to pressure the British government could recognize the Stuart court, grant it subsidies, allow it to recruit troops. The shadow government made the Stuart claimant a piece on the diplomatic chessboard, not powerful in his own right, but potentially useful to others. The more elaborate and official the Stuart court appeared, the more credible it was as a diplomatic tool. But these shadow governments also created their own problems. They required funding, ceremonies, officials, and courts all cost money. The pretenders were always dependent on subsidies from foreign monarchs, and when those subsidies were cut or reduced, the whole elaborate structure risked collapse. The Stuart court lurched from one financial crisis to another, constantly begging for money to maintain the fiction of governance. They also created legal contradictions. If two governments both claim to legitimately rule the same territory, which one's laws are valid? If the Hanoverian government passes a law, but the Stuart court declares it invalid, what is a loyal subject supposed to do? These weren't just theoretical questions. Actual people faced real consequences depending on which authority they obeyed. There's something both admirable and absurd about these shadow governments. Admirable because they represent an absolute commitment to principle over practicality. We claim to be the legitimate government, so we will govern, even if it's only ourselves. Absurd because the whole elaborate structure rested on nothing. It was all performance, ritual, empty of meaning, a play where the actors had forgotten they were acting. Consider the ceremonial life of James Francis Edward Stuart's court. Every day included rituals of kingship, the lever, the ceremonial getting out of bed, audiences, formal meals eaten in state, evening ceremonies, all conducted with the exact protocol used at Versailles or the British court. But for what purpose? Who benefited from the old pretender eating his dinner alone at a table, while courtiers stood in strict order of precedence, watching? Yet these rituals mattered intensely to the participants. They were preserving something sacred, the proper forms of kingship, the ancient traditions, the correct way things should be done. If they let the rituals lapse, if they abandoned the forms, then what were they fighting for? The shadow government existed to prove that there was something worth restoring, that the forms and traditions of legitimate government were being preserved even in exile. Some of these shadow governments lasted for generations. The Stuart court in exile persisted for over a century, outlasting many real governments. The Byzantine court in exile in various forms continued for decades after the fall of Constantinople. These weren't brief episodes of wishful thinking. They were sustained, multi-generational projects to maintain governmental legitimacy, despite having no actual government. The question they raise is profound. What makes a government real? Is it the possession of territory and the ability to enforce laws? Or is it the proper forms, the legitimate succession, the sacred rituals of authority? Our pretenders believed the latter. They thought that if they maintained proper governmental forms, they remained the true government regardless of who actually held power. History has judged them wrong. We remember the governments that held actual power, not the ones that maintained proper forms. But perhaps they weren't entirely wrong. The forms do matter. Legitimacy is more than just force, and sometimes maintaining the forms of proper government in exile preserves something worth preserving, even if it never translates back into actual power. The shadow governments of our kings without kingdoms were monuments to a particular kind of faith. Faith that right would eventually prevail over might, that legitimacy would eventually triumph over usurpation, that keeping the forms alive was itself a kind of resistance against the illegitimate present. It was a beautiful faith. It was also, almost always, entirely wrong. In our focus on the pretenders themselves, we've so far neglected another crucial dimension of these stories: the women who supported, enabled, and sometimes drove these hopeless causes. Behind many of our kings without kingdoms were queens without realms, mothers without futures, and daughters without dowries. Their stories are often even more tragic than those of the men who claim the crowns. Let's begin with Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI. Here was a woman who married a king of England and France, expecting a life of magnificent power and influence. What she got instead was a husband whose mind frequently broke, a kingdom that descended into civil war, and decades of desperate struggle to preserve a crown that kept slipping from her grasp. When Henry VI descended into his first period of madness, Margaret effectively ruled England as Queen Regent. She was politically astute, ruthlessly ambitious for her son, and willing to make the hard decisions her husband could not. But she was also a foreign-born woman in a deeply misogynistic society, which meant every decision she made was questioned, every move she made was suspect. The Yorkists portrayed Margaret as a she-wolf, a foreign temptress who controlled the weak king, a French schemer who betrayed English interests. Was this fair? Absolutely not, but it was effective propaganda. Margaret became the villain of her own story, blamed for her husband's weakness, for the wars that erupted, for the chaos that engulfed England. After the final collapse of the Lancastrian cause, Margaret was captured, ransomed, and eventually allowed to return to France, where she lived out her remaining years in poverty and obscurity. The last years of her life were spent in a shabby chateau, dependent on a small pension from the French king. All her ambitions turned to ashes. She who had been Queen of England ended her days as a poor relation, remembered only as a symbol of foreign interference and failed ambition. Then there's Sophia Paleologina, the Byzantine princess, who married into Russian royalty. Unlike Margaret, Sophia could be said to have succeeded. She helped establish her adopted homeland as the Third Rome, the true heir to Byzantine glory. But at what cost? Sophia left behind her entire world, language, culture, everything familiar, to marry a man she'd never met in a distant, frozen land. She brought with her Byzantine scholars, artists, and traditions, consciously working to transform Moscow into a new Constantinople. In this, she achieved something remarkable, but she also spent the rest of her life as an exile, never again seeing the Mediterranean sun, never hearing Greek spoken except among her dwindling band of Byzantine refugees. Did she consider it worth it? We'll never know, but we do know that she embodied a particular kind of sacrifice made by many women in these stories. The sacrifice of self for dynastic continuity, the subordination of personal happiness to abstract principles of legitimate succession. Consider Clementina Sobieska, wife of James Francis Edward Stuart, the Old Pretender. This Polish princess married the Stuart claimant in 1719, hoping to help restore the Catholic monarchy to Britain. Instead, she found herself living in exile in Rome, perpetually short of money, surrounded by squabbling courtiers, married to a man increasingly consumed by melancholy and resignation. Clementina's marriage collapsed under the strain. She separated from her husband, accusing his advisors of controlling him and excluding her. She withdrew to a convent where she lived in increasingly severe conditions, apparently punishing herself for the failure of the Stuart cause. She died in 1735, aged only 32, worn out by austerity, stress, and disappointed hope. What did Clementina gain from her marriage to a king without a kingdom? Nothing but misery. She could have married almost any Catholic prince in Europe. Her blood was excellent, her dowry substantial. Instead, she tied her fate to the hopeless Stuart cause and paid for it with her health, her happiness, and ultimately her life. And what of the daughters of these pretenders? Princess Louise Marie Stuart, daughter of James Francis Edward, was born in exile, raised in exile, and died in exile. She was a princess of a kingdom that didn't recognize her existence. Her marriage prospects were limited. Who wants to marry the daughter of a failed pretender? She spent her life in the shadow of her brother Charles Edward Stuart's military adventures, never able to carve out a role or identity independent of her family's hopeless claim. These women lived in a peculiar kind of limbo. They had royal status in theory but lacked the power, wealth, or prospects that should come with such status. They were too important to have normal lives, but not important enough to have meaningful royal ones. They existed in a twilight zone between royalty and obscurity. Some women, however, became the driving force behind their male relatives' claims. Margaret of Burgundy, sister of Edward IV, became the most committed supporter of the pretender Perkin Warbeck. She recognized him as her nephew, the supposedly murdered Prince Richard, and backed him financially and politically until his capture and execution. Was she deluded? Or was she cynically using a pretender to damage the Tudor regime that had overthrown her family? We can't know for certain, but what's clear is that Margaret had agency in a way many of these women did not. She chose to support Warbeck, committed resources to his cause, and accepted the political consequences. Similarly, some of the Highland women who supported the Jacobite cause were active participants, not passive supporters. They hid fugitives, carried messages, gathered intelligence, and sometimes fought. After Culloden, many of these women faced severe punishment, their properties confiscated, their families scattered, their entire way of life destroyed. What motivated them? Partly political conviction, genuine belief in the Stuart claim, partly clan loyalty and personal relationships, but also perhaps a sense that supporting a hopeless cause was itself an act of defiance, a way of asserting that legitimacy and principle mattered more than brute power. The most tragic women in these stories might be those who were used as political pawns without any say in their fate. When Lambert Simnel was crowned in Ireland, there were discussions of marrying him to a suitable noblewoman to give his claim more legitimacy. Imagine being that woman, married to a pretender everyone knew was probably a commoner's son, your entire life yoked to an obvious fraud for the political convenience of ambitious men. These women's stories remind us that the human cost of pretension extended far beyond the pretenders themselves. Wives, mothers, daughters, sisters, all were dragged into these hopeless causes, their lives constrained by their male relatives' impossible dreams. They had even less agency than the pretenders, even less ability to escape or start over. They were prisoners of other people's delusions, and history barely remembers their names. Yet without them, many of these pretenders would have given up much sooner. It was often the women who kept hope alive, who insisted on maintaining proper protocol, who refused to accept the reality of defeat. They were the custodians of dignity in exile, the preservers of ritual and tradition, the embodiments of faith that restoration would someday come. In this, they succeeded. The rituals were preserved, the traditions were maintained, the faith was kept alive. But at such a cost. So many lives poured into causes that would never succeed, so much potential wasted on impossible dreams, so much suffering in service to abstract principles of legitimacy that mattered to almost no one except those already caught in the trap. You might think that the age of kings without kingdoms ended with the medieval period, or perhaps with the final extinction of the Jacobite cause. But echoes of this phenomenon continue into the modern era, though in modified forms. Let's explore how the basic dynamic, legitimate claims to power without actual power, has manifested in more recent history. Consider the various governments in exile during World War II. When Nazi Germany conquered Poland, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France, the legitimate governments of these nations fled to London, where they continued to function as the legal authorities of their conquered homelands. They had all the forms of government, ministers, cabinets, legal systems, but no territory to govern. Were they kings without kingdoms? In a sense, yes. They claimed to be the rightful governments of nations they couldn't actually rule. They issued laws and decrees that couldn't be enforced in their occupied homelands. They maintained embassies and diplomatic relations based on legal fictions. But there was one crucial difference. Everyone knew these were temporary situations. The governments in exile existed to preserve legitimate authority until the territories could be liberated. And indeed, when the war ended, these governments returned to power. They were vindicated. Their claims, which had seemed theoretical during the darkest days of occupation, became reality again. This distinguishes them from our medieval pretenders. The World War II governments in exile had reasonable hope of restoration. They were maintaining continuity during a crisis, not clinging to increasingly impossible dreams. Yet the parallel exists: the maintenance of governmental forms without actual power, the insistence on legal legitimacy despite military defeat, the performance of sovereignty in exile. More troubling are the Cold War-era governments in exile that never returned to power. The Lithuanian, Latvian, and Estonian governments in exile, established when the Soviet Union annexed the Baltic states in 1940, continued to function for 50 years. Diplomats represented nations that officially didn't exist. Consulates maintained documents for citizens scattered across the globe. Legal continuity was preserved through 5 decades of Soviet occupation. These governments were finally vindicated when the Baltic states regained independence in 1991. But imagine being a diplomat for the Lithuanian government in exile in 1980. You're representing a nation that hasn't existed as an independent state in your lifetime. Your government has no territory, no tax revenue, no population under its jurisdiction. You maintain embassies through the courtesy of host nations, funded by private donations in the dwindling resources of exiles. You issue passports that most countries don't recognize. You represent a cause that seems increasingly hopeless, and yet you persist. Because the alternative, accepting the Soviet annexation as legitimate, is unthinkable. Because maintaining the legal fiction of continuity, however tenuous, preserves the possibility of future restoration. Because sometimes, against all odds, impossible dreams come true. Then there are the pretenders to abolished monarchies. Throughout Europe and beyond, there are people who maintain claims to thrones that no longer exist. They style themselves as kings, princes, and dukes. They maintain courts in miniature, grant titles, and perpetuate dynastic succession for monarchies that were abolished generations ago. The Orleanist and legitimist claimants to the French throne continue their rivalry, despite France having been a republic since 1870. Multiple families claim the German imperial throne. There are pretenders to the Brazilian, Mexican, Ethiopian, and countless other abolished monarchies. Some of these claimants are treated with deference by certain social circles. Others are ignored or mocked. None have any realistic prospect of restoration. Why do they continue? Partly tradition. If your family has maintained a claim for generations, abandoning it feels like betrayal. Partly identity. Being the heir to a throne, even one that doesn't exist, provides a clear sense of who you are. And partly hope, however faint, that circumstances might somehow change. These modern pretenders are gentler figures than our medieval claimants. They don't typically lead armies or launch invasions. They don't maintain shadow governments or issue rival proclamations. They mostly attend ceremonies, give interviews, and preserve historical traditions. They've made peace with their irrelevance in a way the Jacobites or Byzantine exiles never could. Yet they still maintain the claim, still insist on their titles, still perform the role of royalty without the substance of power. They are living fossils, preserving traditions and claims that have no practical meaning in the modern world. Perhaps the most interesting modern parallel involves disputed territories and unrecognized states. There are currently several entities that claim to be independent nations, but are recognized by few or no other countries: Somaliland, Transnistria, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Northern Cyprus. Are the leaders of these entities kings without kingdoms? In a sense, yes. They govern territories but lack international recognition, existing in legal limbo. Conversely, there are governments that are internationally recognized but control little or no actual territory. For a time, the Republic of China, Taiwan, claimed to be the legitimate government of all China, despite controlling only Taiwan and a few small islands. This claim became increasingly theoretical over time, eventually being quietly abandoned by most. The Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic claims sovereignty over Western Sahara, which is actually controlled by Morocco. The Palestinian Authority claims statehood over territories it doesn't fully control. These situations create the same basic dynamic we've been exploring: legitimate claims to governance meeting the reality of limited or non-existent power. What all these modern examples share with our medieval claimants is the gap between legal claim and political reality. They maintain that they have the right to rule, even when they manifestly lack the power to do so. They insist that legitimacy is more fundamental than actual control. They preserve the forms of governance in hope that someday the substance will follow. And sometimes, rarely but sometimes, they're vindicated. The Baltic states regained independence. Some governments in exile returned to power after World War II. Against all probability, impossible dreams occasionally become reality. But far more often, they don't. Far more often, the pretenders die in exile, their claims passing to heirs who have even less chance of success, until eventually the whole thing fades into historical curiosity. The modern world has less patience for pretenders than the medieval world did. We value effective governance over dynastic legitimacy, practical power over theoretical right, yet the pretenders persist, and their persistence raises questions that are still relevant. What makes authority legitimate? Is the legal right to rule more important than the practical ability to govern? Should we honor claims based on principle even when they have no prospect of success? How long should we maintain legal fictions in hope of eventual vindication? These questions don't have simple answers. They force us to think about the nature of sovereignty, legitimacy, and political authority in ways that our normal pragmatic politics usually avoids. And in that sense, even today's irrelevant pretenders serve a purpose. They make us question assumptions we usually take for granted. The age of kings without kingdoms hasn't truly ended. It's just changed form. As long as there are political disputes about legitimate authority, as long as there are exiled governments and disputed territories, as long as there are people who claim rights they cannot exercise, we'll continue to see echoes of the same dynamic that created our medieval ghost kings. The names change, the circumstances shift, but the basic human tendency to maintain hopeless claims in defiance of reality remains constant. We've journeyed together through centuries now, walking with these sad figures who claimed crowns they would never wear, kingdoms they would never rule. We've seen their rise and fall, their hopes and despairs, their persistence, and their ultimate irrelevance. What can we learn from these kings without kingdoms? First, and perhaps most importantly, their stories teach us about the nature of legitimacy itself. In the medieval worldview, legitimacy was supposedly clear-cut. Sacred bloodlines, divine appointment, unbreakable succession. Yet in practice, legitimacy was constantly contested, constantly being negotiated through force and fraud. Our pretenders believed absolutely in their legitimate right to rule, and they were absolutely powerless. This teaches us that legitimacy alone is never enough. You can have the most impeccable claim, the most sacred bloodline, the most rightful inheritance, and still end up with nothing if you lack the power to make your claim effective. Right without might is just a beautiful idea, powerless before the harsh realities of politics and war. But the opposite is also true. Might without right creates its own problems. The usurpers who took our pretenders' thrones often struggled with legitimacy throughout their reigns. They won the crown by force but never completely convinced everyone they had the right to wear it. This created instability, rebellions, and the opening for new pretenders to emerge. Perhaps the truth is that successful kingship requires both legitimacy and power, right and might working together. When they come apart, you get either usurpers who constantly face challenges to their authority, or pretenders who have all the theoretical right in the world and none of the practical power. Second, these stories reveal something profound about human psychology. Our inability to let go of identities that define us, even when clinging to them brings only suffering. Charles Edward Stuart could have given up his claim, accepted a comfortable pension from some European monarch, and lived out his days in peace. Instead, he insisted on being Charles III until his death, choosing identity over happiness, principle over practicality. Was this admirable or pathetic? Perhaps both. There's something noble about refusing to compromise on your deepest convictions. But there's also something tragic about a life consumed by impossible dreams, unable to adapt, unable to find meaning beyond a claim that will never be realized. This raises difficult questions about when persistence becomes delusion, when faith becomes foolishness. At what point should our pretenders have admitted defeat and moved on? Was there honor in their stubborn resistance, or just waste? We can admire their conviction while also recognizing the terrible price it extracted from them and those around them. Third, these stories illuminate the performative nature of power. Medieval kingship was as much about ritual and symbol as about actual governance. The coronation, the regalia, the court ceremonies, these weren't just decorative elements. They were constitutive of kingship itself. This is why our pretenders maintained elaborate shadow courts and insisted on proper forms even in exile. They understood that kingship was a performance, and they were determined to keep performing even without an audience. In our modern era, we think we've moved past this. We imagine that political power is more rational now, based on elections and institutions, rather than rituals and symbols. But is this really true? Don't we still have elaborate ceremonies around power? Don't our leaders still perform authority through ritual and symbol? Perhaps the performative aspect of power is more fundamental than we like to admit. Fourth, these stories warn us about the cost of ambition, not just to the ambitious themselves, but to everyone around them. The wives who married kings without kingdoms, the children raised in exile, the followers who sacrificed everything for hopeless causes. These people paid the price for other people's dreams. Every failed pretender left a trail of broken lives behind them. Soldiers who died in futile battles, families impoverished by confiscations, communities destroyed in reprisals, all in service to claims that, in hindsight, were obviously hopeless from the start. This should make us cautious about romantic narratives of noble failure. Yes, there's something compelling about the underdog fighting against impossible odds, but we should also count the cost, acknowledge the suffering, recognize that sometimes giving up is the wiser choice. Fifth, these stories demonstrate how historical contingency works. None of our pretenders succeeded in their ultimate goals, yet they all shaped history in unexpected ways. The Jacobite rebellions didn't restore the Stuarts, but they fundamentally changed Highland Scotland. The Byzantine exiles didn't recapture Constantinople, but they transmitted Greek learning to the West, influencing the Renaissance. Even failed pretenders can have historical significance. This suggests that success and failure aren't always clear-cut. You can fail in your stated objective, but still matter, still influence events, still leave a mark on history. Perhaps some of our pretenders would take comfort in knowing that while they didn't regain their crowns, they weren't entirely forgotten, that their struggles meant something even in defeat. Finally, and perhaps most poignantly, these stories remind us of the fundamental human capacity for hope in the face of hopelessness. Our pretenders maintain their claims against all evidence, against all probability. This could be seen as delusion, but it could also be seen as a kind of faith. Faith that right would eventually prevail, that legitimacy would ultimately triumph, that their suffering had meaning. Sometimes this faith was vindicated. The Baltic governments in exile eventually saw their nations restored. Far more often it wasn't. The Jacobites died in exile. The Byzantine emperors never reconquered Constantinople. But the faith itself, that stubborn refusal to accept defeat, tells us something important about human nature. We are capable of maintaining hope even when hope is irrational. We can believe in causes that we know, intellectually, are probably lost. We can dedicate our lives to principles that may never be vindicated. This capacity can lead us to waste our lives on impossible dreams. But it can also lead us to achieve impossible things, to persist when any rational person would give up, to occasionally, against all odds, prove the cynics wrong. Our kings without kingdoms mostly proved the cynics right. They were dreamers who never woke up, claimants who never claimed anything, kings who ruled only their own delusions. Their stories are cautionary tales about the dangers of pride, ambition, and an inability to adapt to reality. But there are also stories of conviction, loyalty, and faith. Stories of people who believed in something so deeply they couldn't let it go, even when letting go was the only rational choice. Stories that make us think about what we would fight for, what we would cling to, how we would face the loss of everything we believed we were meant to be. Thank you for taking this journey with me through the shadows of history, through the lives of these forgotten rulers of nothing. If this story has moved you, if it's made you think, please do subscribe to the channel and share this video with others who love history's hidden stories. Drop a comment below telling me which historical figure you'd like to explore next. Your engagement truly makes these videos possible. Remember that these weren't just historical curiosities. These were real people who lived real lives, who felt real pain, who dreamed real dreams. They may have been kings without kingdoms, but they were never less than human. And in their very human struggles with loss, identity, and impossible hope, we see reflections of our own lives, our own dreams, our own refusal to accept that some things can never be. Until next time, dear travelers through history, may you never become a monarch of nothing, but may you always hold fast to what truly matters. In our modern era, we think we've moved past this. We imagine that political power is more rational now, based on elections and institutions, rather than rituals and symbols. But is this really true? Don't we still have elaborate ceremonies around power? Don't our leaders still perform authority through ritual and symbol? Perhaps the performative aspect of power is more fundamental than we like to admit. Fourth, these stories warn us about the cost of ambition, not just to the ambitious themselves, but to everyone around them. The wives who married kings without kingdoms, the children raised in exile, the followers who sacrificed everything for hopeless causes. These people paid the price for other people's dreams. Every failed pretender left a trail of broken lives behind them. Soldiers who died in futile battles, families impoverished by confiscations, communities destroyed in reprisals, all in service to claims that, in hindsight, were obviously hopeless from the start. This should make us cautious about romantic narratives of noble failure. Yes, there's something compelling about the underdog fighting against impossible odds, but we should also count the cost, acknowledge the suffering, recognize that sometimes giving up is the wiser choice. Fifth, these stories demonstrate how historical contingency works. None of our pretenders succeeded in their ultimate goals, yet they all shaped history in unexpected ways. The Jacobite rebellions didn't restore the Stuarts, but they fundamentally changed Highland Scotland. The Byzantine exiles didn't recapture Constantinople, but they transmitted Greek learning to the West, influencing the Renaissance. Even failed pretenders can have historical significance. This suggests that success and failure aren't always clear-cut. You can fail in your stated objective, but still matter, still influence events, still leave a mark on history. Perhaps some of our pretenders would take comfort in knowing that while they didn't regain their crowns, they weren't entirely forgotten, that their struggles meant something even in defeat. Finally, and perhaps most poignantly, these stories remind us of the fundamental human capacity for hope in the face of hopelessness. Our pretenders maintain their claims against all evidence, against all probability. This could be seen as delusion, but it could also be seen as a kind of faith. Faith that right would eventually prevail, that legitimacy would ultimately triumph, that their suffering had meaning. Sometimes this faith was vindicated. The Baltic governments in exile eventually saw their nations restored. Far more often it wasn't. The Jacobites died in exile. The Byzantine emperors never reconquered Constantinople. But the faith itself, that stubborn refusal to accept defeat, tells us something important about human nature. We are capable of maintaining hope even when hope is irrational. We can believe in causes that we know, intellectually, are probably lost. We can dedicate our lives to principles that may never be vindicated. This capacity can lead us to waste our lives on impossible dreams. But it can also lead us to achieve impossible things, to persist when any rational person would give up, to occasionally, against all odds, prove the cynics wrong. Our kings without kingdoms mostly proved the cynics right. They were dreamers who never woke up, claimants who never claimed anything, kings who ruled only their own delusions. Their stories are cautionary tales about the dangers of pride, ambition, and an inability to adapt to reality. But they are also stories of conviction, loyalty, and faith. Stories of people who believed in something so deeply they couldn't let it go, even when letting go was the only rational choice. Stories that make us think about what we would fight for, what we would cling to, how we would face the loss of everything we believed we were meant to be. Thank you for taking this journey with me through the shadows of history, through the lives of these forgotten rulers of nothing. If this story has moved you, if it's made you think, please do subscribe to the channel and share this video with others who love history's hidden stories. Drop a comment below telling me which historical figure you'd like to explore next. Your engagement truly makes these videos possible. Remember that these weren't just historical curiosities. These were real people who lived real lives, who felt real pain, who dreamed real dreams. They may have been kings without kingdoms, but they were never less than human. And in their very human struggles with loss, identity, and impossible hope, we see reflections of our own lives, our own dreams, our own refusal to accept that some things can never be. Until next time, dear travelers through history, may you never become a monarch of nothing, but may you always hold fast to what truly matters.